Do you ever wonder what the recipes mean by medium heat, or moderately high heat, or low heat? Does your smoke alarm go off at that too often? Well, then this video is for you. Today we're learning to judge the heat on the stovetop. The rookies judge the heat by the knobs on their stove. 10 is high, 1 is low, 5 is medium. If a recipe says to cook on medium heat, they set their knob to 5. Does that work? Nope. More experienced cooks don't look at the knobs, they look at the food. If the food is burning, they turn the heat down. If the food is sweating, they turn the heat up. And that's okay, but if you want to take it to a whole other level of mastery, you don't only look at the food, but you listen to it. The sound gives you instant feedback. It's like a speedometer on your car. It tells you the speed of your browning. It also tells you how to avoid setting off your smoke alarms. If you listen to the food, you might not need to listen to the smoke alarm nearly as often. Before some smarty pants tells me in the comments that their soup doesn't make any sound no matter what the heat setting is, let me clarify. In this video I am talking about things you cook without the addition of liquid. For example, searing a steak, sautéing vegetables, and sweating mirepoix. Obviously, boiling water doesn't produce the same sound as a searing steak, even if they are both on high heat. Whenever I am cooking something in class, there are always a few students who are squinting at the knobs on my stove as if that's going to tell them something. Here's what they'll see: high, medium, low. Can you tell the difference between medium and low on the knobs? Neither can I, but it's a big difference. Of course, you might say that I have bad knobs without numbers, but here is the problem with numbers. 10 on a little burner produces a completely different amount of heat than 10 on a big burner. The same applies to all the other numbers. All burners, stoves, and pans are different. Even on the same burner, you might need completely different heat settings for different pans because some conduct heat way faster than others. So if the knobs are useless, how do you judge the heat? Looking at the food is a good idea. If you wanted to brown some meat or vegetables but noticed moisture accumulating in the pan, your heat setting is obviously too low and you should crank it up. You should also start at a higher heat next time you cook this kind of dish. Now let's talk about a case where your ingredients are burning. Here the culprit could be too much heat or too much time. You can try reducing either one next time to see if you get better results. But all these measures are reactionary. They only help you adjust after the problem is already happening, which is often too late. The sound is instant. The moment my food hits the pan, I know if I need to make any adjustments. I don't need to wait for the problem. Normally, I don't record the sound of the food cooking for my videos because it distracts from the voiceover that I record later. But for this video, I recorded the sound and I turned off my ventilation hood so as not to confuse you with its noise. I cooked some chicken thighs on 3 heat settings. The lowest my burner could give me, the highest, and in the middle. Here's what it sounded like. Here's low. It should sound like a whisper. Here's high. It should sound like loud cracking and popping. Here is medium. It should sound like a steady hiss. Can you brown on all 3 settings? Yes, but not equally well. If your food sounds like this, it will take you 20 minutes to get any color. In a recipe, I'd call the setting low. The downside of taking this long to brown is that the chicken might stick to the pan. If your chicken sounds like this, it will brown in 2 to 3 minutes. In a recipe, I'd call the setting high. When I tried this setting for the video, there were a few downsides. The first was that the fat in the pan turned slightly rancid. In other words, it had an off-putting aroma. The second was that the smoke alarm went off. I have a good hood that vents outside, so normally it's almost impossible for me to set off the smoke alarms. But remember that I was not using my hood while shooting this footage, so this was a perfect simulation of what would happen for most home cooks who don't have a good hood. If you have one of those recirculating models, your smoke alarms probably go off a lot, but they don't need to. If your chicken sounds like this, you'll get great color in about 7 minutes with no smoke alarms. In a recipe, I'd call this setting medium, though I'm not very consistent and sometimes call it moderately high. What I mean by that is high enough to get good browning, but no higher. There are certainly cases where you need the fastest possible browning. One such example is searing meat after cooking it sous vide. The meat is already done and you want instant browning. Or maybe you're cooking a very thin piece of meat like a skirt steak and you want it to get really crispy before the inside overcooks. But in most cases, it's perfectly fine and even desirable to go a bit slower. I know what you're thinking. The sound is good and all, but how do I find the initial setting? See, the recipe says medium high or medium low. When the pan is preheating, there is no sound, even if you put oil into it. So how do I know what to set my knob to? The first step to figuring it out is to ignore the heat setting the recipe suggests and instead figure out whether the recipe writer is asking you to brown something or to sweat something. For example, the recipe might say cook on medium-high heat until the first side browns. Or it might say cook on medium-low until the onions are translucent and tender. If the recipe wants browning, it's always safer to start very high and turn down the heat later. The initial blast of heat will make sure your food won't stick. But as soon as the food hits the pan, you can adjust the heat based on the sound. If you are on an electric stove, you can always pull the pan off the burner for short intervals until your burner calms down. This doesn't mean you are setting your knob to 10. You know your stove best. If you have some burners with a huge output, you might want to start on 8 or 9. If the recipe doesn't want browning, err on the side of too low than too high. Let's take that onion example. If you misjudged and set your heat too low, and there are no signs of life coming from your pan, just crank up the heat a tad. The worst that happens is that your onions take extra long to cook, but they'll turn out just fine. If, however, you set your heat too high, they might start browning as soon as they hit the pan, and in some cases that's not what you want. Here is what slowly cooked onions sound like. Professionals call this sweating. In the beginning, they are producing a lot of moisture, so there is really not much sound coming from them. It's like a quiet whisper. Once the moisture evaporates and they start to turn brown, the sound changes into a quiet hiss. This is when you want to stir them more often. Of course, even the same pan and the same heat setting can produce completely different results depending on how long you preheat the pan. This pan was preheating on high for 2 minutes. Here's the same pan on the same burner preheating on medium for 4 minutes. It's louder because it's hotter. I routinely preheat my pans on higher settings than I plan to use simply because it saves me time. Let's take the example of sweating the onions. I set the pan on fairly high heat and put the oil or some other fat in. I don't wait for the pan to preheat because I don't want immediate color. I add the onions and then I wait. When I get the sound I want, I turn down the heat to maintain that sizzle. This saves me about 5 minutes. Otherwise, it takes forever for anything to happen in the pan at all. But this requires knowing your burner and your pan really well, so it's not for everyone. If you want browning, preheating the pan before the food goes in is key. You can't put the chicken in the pan as soon as you set it over the burner, right? Ideally, you want to preheat your pan only long enough for the food to give you the right sound from the very beginning. The more you cook with a specific burner and skillet, the more intuition you'll get. Unfortunately, this intuition will apply to that particular burner-pan combination. Every time I cook in someone else's house, I have to rebuild my intuition. So if you got a new stove or a new pan, just give it some time. It's always rough in the beginning. For more pan preheating tips, check out my video on pan secrets chefs don't tell you. I cover different pan materials and the best way to preheat each one. Here are more thought-provoking culinary videos for you to check out, and if you are ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes.